Welcome to the headline. I'm Dave Briggs here on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. Will the cautious consumer be a drag on corporate earnings and the economy? Home Depot firing off a warning shot this week, in part blaming poor earnings on customers feeling a sense of, quote, greater uncertainty in the economy. Let's talk about it with Jerome Martis, Director of Consumer Research at LSEG. Jerome, nice to see you. We will hammer down, if you will, on Home Depot in a moment. But first, just big picture, what's your sense of the consumer?
Well, it's good to be here, Dave. When we look at our LSEG forecast for the current quarter that retailers are reporting, there's definitely a significant slowdown from what we've seen over the previous 2 years. Our LSEG Retail and Restaurant Index is only looking at a 12.9% growth rate. This is a significant slowdown even from the previous quarter, where we saw that consumers splurge after the holiday season. And this is mainly because consumers have become very price conscious. The value proposition is key for them. They are being more strategic when they open up their wallets. They're waiting for those promotions to come up in order to actually buy what they need. And what we're hearing right now, too, is that for the first time, even the middle-class consumer is pulling back on spending.
I was just going to say,
Yes.
It's usually a bifurcated look at the consumer. So where are we seeing the weakness, or is it across the board, high income, low income, and the middle?
No, we are seeing the weakness across the board. And what's very concerning is that it's this quarter that is marking the big difference that we saw previously to what is about to happen forward. The main culprit here is the unemployment rate. This is in line with our LSEG research that shows that traditionally, once the unemployment starts flashing red above that 4% mark, that's when we see consumers pull back on spending and put their hands in their pockets.
The scorecard you referenced also shows 70% beating earnings, at least on EPS. So does that give us a better sense of things are still healthy?
It's in line with what we've seen before, but the beat is still not as strong as we've seen before. And even though there's a slight beat, even though the majority is still beating, the earnings growth rate forecast is still not as high as previous quarters. It's still 12.9. Yes, it's double digits, but before we used to see closer to 30%. So this is a significant drop, underlying the fact that consumers have been holding back. Now, when we look at the second quarter, there are some pockets of hope where consumers did spend, and that's mainly among the apparel sector. But this is because it was highly discounted and they had some really good values to lure in those consumers. But other than the apparel, e-commerce was very strong. That was very evident yesterday with Home Depot's numbers that came in at 4%, much stronger than expectations of 0.3. Walmart is on track to post its 8th consecutive quarter of double-digit e-commerce tomorrow at 15%. So what we're seeing is that the omni-channel proposition is very key for the American consumer. They're all about instant gratification. Home Depot told us that about 50% of those e-commerce orders were actually fulfilled to pick up in store. So the consumer is really big on instant gratification, and the retailers that are able to offer that really good omni-channel like Walmart, Home Depot are the ones that are doing better.
On Home Depot, again, they warned about the greater sense of the economy, though they've been struggling a bit as interest rates have been high, and they've had some relatively okay quarters, if not subpar. So is this warning about the economy fair, or is this just a Home Depot problem?
It's actually a scary warning, meaning because...
But they also rely heavily on pros, right, as opposed to average Joes.
So during the earnings call, they said that the pros, for the first time, are actually concerned about the macroeconomic situation and therefore are pulling back on those major revamping of bathrooms and kitchens. Even the high-end consumer is not financing as much for those remodeling. And what was more scary was the fact that the merchandise that is over, the big ticket items over $1,000, dropped by 6%. So this is telling you how price conscious, value conscious, the consumer's thinking twice before making those big ticket item purchases.
I know I certainly am. This is just a minor story, it would seem, at least on social media. There's been a lot of blowback about the political donations by the founder of Home Depot, Bernie Marcus. Some people saying they boycotted it. Have you heard anything about that, about the impact on Home Depot, the political left having an issue with those donations?
I would say if there's a company, a retailer being more hurt by that would be Starbucks, which has been a lot in the news. They are now on track to post their third consecutive quarter of negative same-store sales. So the change in management comes in at a good time, given everything that Starbucks is going to. I would say, though, in addition to those factors, there's also the fact that when it comes to coffee, consumers are all about instant gratification. They want their coffee now. And the fact that you can order your Starbucks coffee over the app, but then have to wait for it, and even if you go into the store, has definitely put Starbucks at a disadvantage. And that's where Chipotle has the upper hand, because they have a whole second assembly just dedicated to those online orders.
Brian Nickel here to save the day. He's got a heck of a task. Investors think he's worth $20 billion in market cap right away. Let's talk a bit about Disney. They raised some eyebrows in a bit of a pullback in parks. We saw something similar from Universal. Should that tell us really more about that lesson you just laid out by the consumer, just cutting back in certain areas?
Absolutely. Disney told us during their earnings call that the low-end consumer is definitely pulling back because they're already hurt by the inflation. But the high-end consumer is not even going to their parks. They are traveling. If they're traveling internationally.
Abroad.
Yes. So when we look at our StarMine data, it's interesting because Disney actually has a very weak score. It scores in the bottom decile when it comes to the analyst revisions model.
Why?
This is telling us that analysts have been dramatically lowering all of their financial projections for Disney over the past week. So much so that even though they are bullish on the cruise line sector of Disney expanding, they are still bearish for the most part on Disney because of the increased competition and the price-conscious consumer, and the fact that, Disney has already raised their prices significantly, not only the entry to the park, but also the food and their merchandise for the kids into the store. So as a result, analysts polled by LSEC are mainly bearish on the company. And their forecast, even though they're bullish on the cruises, is that in the near term, we're not going to see any growth in revenue anytime soon, any great revenue.
Very interesting on the House of Mouse. All right, the word overall in retail and in restaurant is value. We hear it time and time again. It was AI, now it's value. As every fast food restaurant is competing over value menus, retail's doing it too. Is that going to continue throughout the fall, throughout the year?
So it's interesting because the travel, or LSEC actually sector, hotels, restaurants, and leisure has been hit the hardest this quarter. I mean, we're talking about for the past 3 years, this was on top with triple-digit, double-digit growth. And for the first time, we're seeing a 1.7 growth rate. Tells you the significantly drastic drop that we're seeing within this sector. Still, the group that is expected to do the best in this group is the restaurants. 70% of the restaurants are expected to post positive same-store sales. These are the restaurants that have a loyal customer following, like Chipotle, Wingstop, and even Dutch Bros, who's competing against Starbucks. So those are the names that tend to do better, the restaurants that have a more loyal following.
We'll still spend on our food. Convenience stores, however, final question here. They are struggling mightily. Walgreens, CVS, Rite Aid really can't close stores fast enough. We're going to see thousands of closures over the next few years. What's the impact?
The impact is what we were talking about earlier, right? The importance of the omni-channel strategy, the importance of value. That's where a company like Walmart and Amazon still excel, because the American consumer is all about instant gratification. They don't want to wait. They want it now. Whether that be like ordering it online, picking it on store, the value proposition, even for the back to school, going all the way into our holiday forecast. We're seeing that consumers are gravitating towards TJ Maxx, Ross, because the value proposition is key. So going forward, the theme of the second half of the year is going to be the value proposition is key for the consumer and the omni-channel experience.
Great news for Amazon. All right, our thanks to Jerome Ortiz, Director of Consumer Research at LSEG. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. All
right, coming up, what polls are saying about who they trust more on the economy, Donald Trump or Kamala Harris? Stay with us. Election day is just over 80 days away, and voters across the country are, for the most part, left in the dark when it comes to the candidates' actual policy positions. We may finally get a glimpse on September 10th when former President Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris debate for the first time. In the meantime, we're here to speculate, here to talk about the road ahead is Politico's economics correspondent, Victoria Guida. Nice to see you. Let's start with the most important issue to voters. That is, of course, your wheelhouse, the economy. Two major surveys out this week showing voters actually trust Kamala Harris more than Trump, which completely flips the narrative we've seen to this point. One from the Financial Times. What do you make of it?
Yeah, so it's a bit early to say for sure, but I think that a natural conclusion might be that how people feel about the economy is particularly based on vibes. Obviously Kamala Harris is President Biden's vice president, and so there's no particular reason to grade her differently. But she also has been presenting more of a forward-looking vision than President Biden did. He spent a considerable amount of time trying to convince people that the economy is good rather than talking about what he might do to make things better. And so it's possible that that's also playing a role. But it's been very interesting to observe because to be fair, Vice President Harris is sort of taking over the campaign at a time when the economy is a little bit easier to sell. I mean, inflation, we got some new data this morning that showed that inflation is continuing to cool, coming back towards the Fed's 2% target. And so we might finally be through that. But things are still expensive. And so, the vibe shift definitely seems to be based around sort of some enthusiasm about her candidacy.
I think you just hit on the most important word to this point, vibe. I think this right now, to this point, has been a vibe campaign, hasn't it?
It really has. I mean, to your point, we don't really know very much about what either of the candidates will do. I mean, President Trump likes to float policy ideas like his, across the board 10% tariff, things like that. But I think that we know that he's very open-ended in what he will or won't do. And I think that those are sort of just he's testing ideas and we don't know exactly what will actually play out. And, Vice President Harris, she obviously just started, but, even President Biden didn't really talk about what he was going to do very much. And I think part of it is they're sort of playing off each other, right? Where if one doesn't necessarily get into the policy details, the other doesn't have to either. And so hopefully we'll see a shift there in the debate.
Yeah, when it comes to Harris, whether it's her past policy positions, whispers about what she might do in the future, or perhaps the appointment of Brian Deese, a White House veteran, what can you take away from her policy stances on the economy?
Yeah, so I mean, she does have some things that we can say that she's consistently held, and the big thing is what the Biden administration calls the care economy, which is basically the child tax credit, the supporting paid family and medical leave, supporting more funding for childcare. And that's an issue that she supported consistently as senator. And that has always been part of the Biden administration agenda, but it hasn't necessarily been as big of a focus. And her running mate, Tim Walz, actually did some of that stuff, particularly paid leave, in his state of Minnesota. And so we could see that be a bigger focus. But she's not really an ideologue. She's not really someone who has a sort of big vision of what the economy should look like, what kind of systemic change we should see, the way you might associate with like an Elizabeth Warren or a Bernie Sanders. She's much more about sort of kitchen table issues of, she's played up the Biden administration's, helping so that medical debt doesn't show up on people's credit scores, things that are sort of like, this is a specific problem people have, and this is a solution. And so it can be hard to sort of extrapolate, but just to kind of, pull it all together, I will say with Brian Deese, one assumes that her views are not going to be radically different from what President Biden has been doing.
If I'm on her campaign, I'm saying the Cook Political Report just shifted 5 of 7 battleground states to her side. So will she do any interviews? Does she have to?
Well, she said that she will do some sort of interview, although it remains to be seen what the format of that is going to be.
Yeah, man, if I'm on that campaign, I'm saying play it safe. We are skyrocketing in the polls. Let's talk Trump now. President Trump finally returning to the campaign trail Wednesday in North Carolina, where it is talking about the economy. Most recently, though, he's been, talking the timeless tradition of airing his many grievances. How is that being received by his supporters?
Yeah, I mean, there is some concern that now that he's running against Vice President Harris, who is a sharper messenger on these issues, that he will need to be a sharper messenger as well. Because as I mentioned, President Biden wasn't necessarily, I mean, he wasn't that comfortable talking about the economy. You could always see it. He always sort of cited outside sources rather than just speaking from his own type of confidence, because he wasn't really an economics type of guy. And you see some, a bit more comfort from Harris in sort of talking about these issues. And so, in the Trump sphere, they really do want to see him be able to provide a sharper message. I mean, that's never quite been his style, although, I mean, President Trump is very interested in economic policy, more so than your average presidential candidate. He's always talking about tariffs and interest rates and things like that do clearly animate him. But I don't know. It might be a little while before he finally sort of settles on a clear message, and who knows if he will stick to it. Yes.
Yeah, Nikki Haley, very critical, saying time to stop whining and start defining your candidate. We do know this about Trump, to your point, tariffs and lower corporate taxes will be the foundation of his economic policy. The former president did a 2-hour X Spaces chat with Elon Musk. What do you take away from that conversation? Might it at all move the needle?
Well, so it sort of plays into what you were just saying, which is, he doesn't necessarily stick to the same points that he hammers over and over, which is something that you want to do in a campaign, right? You want people to have sort of bullet point takeaways of like, okay, if I vote for this person, this is what I'm getting. And we all know this, right? President Trump has been in our lives for many years now. And he will sort of go off on tangents. And I think that, previously it's worked for him because he was sort of like the change candidate. But now he is, you could think of him as an incumbent. He's been in the Oval Office before. And so, now the question is like, well, what will you do? What are you trying to sell to us? And I think that in that space, he just, he hammered the Democrats on inflation, which has been a consistent talking point among Republicans and things like that. But I think that he in this phase of the campaign, might need to do more than that.
Yeah, the one issue we know they actually agree on is this no tax on tips. Trump laid it out. Kamala Harris appears to have echoed that. Is this just a fringe minor issue?
Well, so it's particularly important in the state of Nevada, which is a swing state. There's a lot of hospitality workers that make a lot of tips that that actually cross the threshold into being taxed. And so you can understand how both of these candidates want to seize on issues that could mean the difference between winning the election and not winning the election based on how the Electoral College works, because some of these margins are so thin in some of these states. I think that it's still very unclear to me how this would actually be implemented. There's been a lot of concern out there from experts that this could incentivize, higher earning people to sort of shift to tipping models so that they can avoid taxes. You can imagine a situation where you could design a policy to guard against that. But the ultimate population of people that would be actually affected by it is relatively small. But you can understand why it's attractive as a political selling point.
Yeah, and as we look into our crystal ball and wrap this thing up, will the shape of the economy in the next 80 days determine the outcome of the election? And if so, what are the numbers telling us that will be?
Well, I think it depends specifically on whether the economy shifts a lot from where it is right now. Because, we recently got employment numbers that suggested that the unemployment rate has ticked up. And, that was some of the market turmoil that we saw, last week, at the beginning of last week. But, it's unclear whether that rise in the unemployment rate is going to continue. If it just sort of stays relatively steady where we're at, especially because, the Fed is expected to start cutting interest rates in September, that might have less dramatic of an effect. We are seeing inflation really come back down to 2%. But it's also unclear to me whether that is going to be, Harris is going to be able to politically message that, because, it doesn't mean prices are going down. It just means that they're not going up nearly as fast. And so that I think is a big question going into November, is the extent to which Harris tries to sell people on the fact that, like, look, we did it. We've essentially beaten inflation, and, like, you know, the days will be happier ahead. Because, I mean, the economy hasn't been terrible
No.
for the past couple of years, and people have, as to bring us back to where we started. I mean, some of this is just vibes.
Yeah, a lot of it, and a lot of it is how you sell it. All right, Victoria Guida from Politico, come back and see us after that September debate. Appreciate it. Coming up, the
Sounds
top
great.
business headlines of the week, including details on that major shakeup at Starbucks and Chipotle. Stay with us. Welcome back to the headline. Let's dive into the business news you may have missed this week. No bad news on inflation is good news these days. The Consumer Price Index showing the 12-month inflation rate slipping to 2.9%, the lowest since March 2021. Higher housing costs accounting for a 0.2% increase in inflation for July. Good news for those hoping to see the Federal Reserve cut interest rates in September. And finally, some good news in the housing market. Mortgage refinancing applications jumped 35% last week as interest rates hit their lowest point in over a year, with 30-year fixed-rate mortgage rates dipping slightly to 6.54%. This surge pushing refinancing activity to nearly half of all mortgages. Home purchase applications, meanwhile, rising slightly, still down, though, 8% from last year due to high home prices, low inventory, and uncertainty about future rate cuts. From burritos to baristas, Starbucks has tapped the Chipotle CEO to take over the top role of the coffee chain. CEO Laxman Narasimhan stepping down after less than a year, with Brian Niccol leaving Chipotle and heading to Starbucks, assuming his role September 9th. The surprise shakeup comes as the company tries to appease investors and turn around its sinking stock price. Following the news, shares of Starbucks jumped more than 20%, and Chipotle dropping more than 10%. Paramount restructuring ahead of its merger with Skydance Media seems, well, paramount. The company cutting 15% of its current workforce this week and announced that it will close its studio, with current TV shows and projects transitioning to CBS Studios. The CEOs of Paramount saying, in part, the industry continues to evolve and Paramount is at an inflection point where changes must be made to strengthen our business. Presidential nominees Kamala Harris and Donald Trump may have finally found something they can agree on. The vice president pledging to eliminate taxes on tips during a speech in Nevada, echoing a proposal formally laid out by former President Trump from 2 months prior. This unusual point of agreement between the two sides underscores the bipartisan appeal of this policy, which aims to benefit service and hospitality workers. Trump's campaign criticized Harris for adopting the idea, claiming she lacked original ideas. Harris made the promise while being endorsed by Nevada's powerful culinary union, highlighting the policy's growing support among both parties and lawmakers. That's going to do it for this episode of The Headline. Don't go anywhere. More Cheddar up next.